All right, and we are live. So, welcome everybody to this afternoon stream. Well, afternoon for me, I guess it's evening for Helena.
Correct.
Um, but yeah, this is Real Crusades history, and we're doing a look today at Helena Schrader's book, "The Tale of the English Templar." And there's a lot to get into with that. This is all about the trial of the Templars and kind of taking a historical fiction uh, examination of that incredible event in history. So there's a lot to talk about for us today here. So I'm here with a good friend of mine, a good friend of the channel, very frequent contributor to Real Crusades history and to the whole project. So this is Helena Schrader. Helena, welcome again
Yeah.
to yet another stream.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love being featured.
All right, absolutely. And I'm glad we're getting to do this today. So a little bit of background, Helena let me know that she was re-releasing, I believe, was this your first novel you ever wrote, Helena? Or
Yeah, I think
published
it's
at
the first.
least?
Yeah, it's the first one. No, it's not the first because there's the St. Louis Knight, which is
Okay.
this. When this first came out, it was thought of as a trilogy of Templar novels, which I called the Templar trilogy, and it starts with St. Louis Knight, and then there's Saint Jean of Acre, and then the English Templar. So this was effectively the third book that I published.
Okay.
And then I pulled the second book in the series because I didn't think it was good enough. In retrospect, I got uncomfortable with the fact that it was public. Of course, there are still some copies out there in used bookstores or whatever. I've heard rumors that some of them go for $900 with crazy things like that. It doesn't really matter. I really don't want people to read it. It would be not. And St. Louis Night is still out there. It's actually been released as also as an audiobook. But all of these books are essentially 30 years old.
Okay, great. So yeah, again, this is about the trial of the Templars. Obviously, been a big subject for me. I did a really long documentary about that, just kind of trying to cover the whole history of it a while ago on Real Crusades history. So, uh, and I do recommend, guys, you check out this book. If you go to the description below, you can find a link to Amazon and pick up a copy. I've got mine here. It is a really awesome historical novel, and it kind of takes a lot for me to really get into a historical novel. Obviously there's a lot of lackluster historical fiction out there, but this one really is interesting and really just shows a lot of knowledge of the period. So yeah, Helena, do you want to talk a little bit about why you decided to write this book, what your inspiration was for writing this?
I think we can. Bottom line is, at this time I was living in Europe. I was living in Germany at the time, and if you're out living in northern Europe, it's really nice to get down to the south. So that the south of France was where my husband and I spent a lot of our holidays. And if you're traveling around the south of France and Languedoc, you're going to run into Templars everywhere you go. I think people can't see very well, but I have this marvelous book. It's in French actually here about the site, all of the sites, the site Templar de France. And you can just go to an area. So if you know you're going to be visiting the Auvergne, you can go and say, oh, where were the Templars here? And then you can find a map of all of the, I mean, we're talking little tiny, it's too small here, little tiny parts of France, and they'll still have, a dozen, 2 dozen different Templar commanderies in them. And many of them still have ruins, and you can go and visit. So the bottom line is I was spending a lot of time in the south of France, and I kept running into Templars. I was running into also the places like Najac, where they were kept prisoner. And there was I was also at this time not quite interested in the what do you call the Albigensian crusades, the Albigensian heresies, and that comes because one of the places I stayed, one of the places that we rented, it was a gîte in near Saint Jean de Garde, which had these Cathar roots, traditions, histories around it. So this is one of those cases where probably travel inspired me to dig and do more research. And as you do more research and then the research, and then those places you're visiting become even more meaningful and powerful, etc. So it sort of snowballs into this fascinating fascination with this entire period. and because I am a historian, of course, then I went and got things like Malcolm Barber. Malcolm Barber, of course, was at that time, he's since then died, the most leading scholar on the Knights Templar, and his books, which just take it out of the realm of fantasy and myth and made it very, very human, made me interested in these, because as a historian, as a historical fiction, I am not somebody who likes myth and superhumans and alien creatures or whatever. I'm very, very focused on the human experience. And you're confronted when you get to the story of the destruction of the Knights Templar, because the Knights Templar, they did things, they did good things, they did bad things, they were successful, they sometimes screwed up. They were human beings. They they were part of the Crusades history, as we all know from this channel. But the destruction, this horrible moment where their own church, the head turns on them and sacrifices them in an appalling way, is something that I think just got under my skin. And
Right.
And it's suddenly, it's so horrifying that you don't really want to talk about it and write about it. I'm not always drawn to horror stories. I mean, that's not my thing I like best. And certainly if you're visiting these places in the south of France and you go into the dungeons and then you start getting this, I generally actually don't go into the dungeons. There are places where they have, torture instruments that I generally skip that room. I don't need to see that. And yet this is a real story. This really happened to human beings.
Yeah.
And I think other people who've seen me on other send, I'm someone who's, I call myself, I'm a writer who's very much motivated by an inspiration. I don't intellectually sit down to write a novel. I can sit down if as in my job, if somebody says I need a report on X, Y, and Z, I can sit down and do that. If I can make a totally rational, cold-blooded decision to write a dissertation on X, Y, and Z because it's something that there's not enough info that hasn't been written about, but there's huge, there's a good reason for doing it. I can choose to write a nonfiction book on a topic because it's a good synthesis of other things, but it hasn't been covered before, or I think there's a market for it. I don't write novels like that. I have to be more or less woken up in the middle of the night with a feeling like I've got to write this book. And that happened very much here. The scene that I've now put in the old version, it wasn't in the old version. I left it sort of a third of the way in and worked up to it. But when I went back and did the revision, I thought, no, this is the inspiration. This is what drove me to write this book. And I'm going to put it up front so that this is no spoiler when I say it opens with this basically broken, tortured man who crawls off the back of a prisoner wagon to die. The only thing he really wants is to just stop the pain by getting off the wagon and getting into a ditch in the snow and dying. And he's not allowed to, because the next party that comes along the road insists basically on helping him. The Good Samaritan, the person who doesn't let him die and doesn't turn him back over to the Inquisition, but takes him in and nurtures him back to health. And from there, literally the story, in my mind, I mean, how the story evolved, it's not the way the book was written, but the way the story evolved was entirely, I wrote that scene and my characters took me to the next scene, because after that happened, but then we have to solve this problem, then we have to solve this problem, then we have to solve this problem. So the storyline, the novels, takes its course entirely from the characters. That, however, as I say, is within the structure, on the skeleton of the research I had already done, and trying to keep it within the realm of plausible, credible historical fiction, but interpolating, creating fictional characters and fictional events.
Yeah, that is a really good scene. The portion you're talking about is very memorable, and that actually might be a good place to go next. I'm kind of thinking about these characters, you created for the book. So the character you're talking about is named Percy, and he is a Templar. What's his full name again?
Percival de Lacy.
Okay. So, do you want to talk a little bit about his character and how he like how you created him and sort of what role he plays in the book?
This is Percy's story, and and as I say, he's when he starts
He is
okay,
the English Templar, by the way. I guess I could say
correct. Yeah,
that.
he is English. So he's an English knight who's actually assigned. He's a knight. He's an English nobleman. He's from a, so what's a cadet branch of a baronial family, the Lacy family. They're marcher barons in England, which means obviously he's come up. He's been trained as a knight before he joins the Templar. He comes from a wealthy, powerful family. He's inducted into the Templar by the William de la Moor, who's the master in England. And because he comes from that kind of a good, strong family, he's actually assigned as one of the lucky knights who's sent to Cyprus, which was then the headquarters of the order, because they've lost Accra. So the headquarters where the most of the fighting men were collected on the island of Cyprus, and he's sent there, and he's in the commandery of Cyprus, and he is simply sent with dispatches to the master, who is temporarily at the invitation of King Philip IV in France, and he's stuck in France over the summer because the master keeps delaying his return and keeps changing his mind about what he wants to send and back. And he's returning to Cyprus with the master's dispatches, answers to the officers still on Cyprus when Philip IV strikes, and he's captured he's just staying the night at one of these insignificant little commanderies in the south of France. When, as I say, Philip IV strikes, he ends up in a dungeon and being tortured. So his past is that of a very ordinary, normal knight. He's, been raised in privilege. He's just been one of the knights. He's nothing special, other than what's special by fact of birth. And he's special to the Inquisition because, as people, if you know about the Templar trial in England, they were not tortured, and Edward II sorry, refused to torture them. The French sent their experts, and the English said we have no precedent for torture. There was enough warning given that most of the English Templars were not arrested. William de la Moor and some of the other officers were arrested because they didn't flee, because they intended to defend the order. And this, of course, happened in other places, in Cyprus itself, in Portugal. There were other places in the Holy Roman Empire, for the most part. The Templars weren't either found innocent, or they were arrested, but they were not put to the torture, etc. But for Philip, who's trying to get the order destroyed, this is very dangerous, because that he's got to prove that the order is totally corrupt, and not just that the French Templars are corrupt. So getting a witness, an English witness that confesses, is important to the Inquisition's trial. This is fictional. It is not fictional that the English were not tortured. It is not fictional that Philip IV was very anxious to get the Templars condemned across the world. It is historical that the Pope was trying to get other kingdoms to condemn the Templars, and it's historical that in many kingdoms they were not. But the idea that a single English Templar was important is something I invented, but within the context of that would make sense. If you're a trial lawyer and you're trying to get some evidence beyond, to prove that it wasn't just in France, and having someone like this would be very valuable. So that's so he's valuable to the Inquisition, which is why they focus on him and force him through torture to confess. And at that point, Percy's, now he's broken. He's, as I say, he's a broken person. He's not particularly heroic. And so for me, this book is very much about someone who has been broken, and then how they deal with that fact and recover psychologically. And to the point where, as I say, he starts he doesn't really want to be part of the resistance. He doesn't want to fight back. But as he gets stronger and he starts having some successes, it builds to hubris and errors, and ultimately defeat. There's this whole arc. There's an entire character arc of is that the beginning almost doesn't matter what he was before. The story of Percy is what happens to Percy after he's been broken, and then is restored to health and gradually to power, etc., and how he uses that or doesn't use it. I personally think that some of the most important scenes is there's a priest who he rescues who has also been horribly tortured, and there are discussions between them because they see the issue very differently. Because by Percy is not turning the other cheek. Percy is not doing the completely Christian or Christ-like behavior. He is actually using force against the church. And that is an issue, of course, which is challenged by others people in the book. Am I going too far, Steve?
No, I mean, there's so many interesting things I want to discuss here. But yeah, I think that is one of the interesting things about Percy's character is that the beginning of the book does sort of show the suddenness of this being brought up. There is this myth out there that the Templars kind of went through this. They kind of were gradually getting more corrupt. People started having a problem with them. That's really not true. The Templars, their reputation, their function, it was consistent. And on the like this is actually a thing that Barber and Nicholson talk about in their books, is how when the king of France all of a sudden says, you know what, these guys have to all be arrested. They're a bunch of Satanists and sexual perverts and all this stuff, and the whole order is corrupt, and we're gonna take this. I'm taking this order down. Basically, it was a shock to all of France and to Europe, and that really is conveyed in the story. One minute Percy's going along, he's the mundane tasks of being a member of the Templar Order, and then he's suddenly arrested, and all of a sudden he finds himself in a dungeon and being tortured. And that's another thing I wanted to touch on that you mentioned, is that is a big thing that is explored in this book, is the idea of a power, a government, an authority apprehending people, subjecting them to injustice, basically, which that is, I don't want to, I don't want to get too deep into this yet, but I think this is something that's really interesting to bring up, because this is what the whole story of the trial of the Templars really is about. It's about power wielded unjustly, which of course is the great problem of the human condition. We as human beings constantly find ourselves facing unjust authority. Governments are unjust; they behave unjustly, and that's exactly what happens here. Philip IV of France abuses his power, and it's interesting because he comes from a line of kings who didn't do that. Louis IX of France was a great king, was an entirely great king who was a friend to the Templars and did the higher. He pursued the higher things. He pursued the crusade. He pursued the selfless things. But then all of a sudden, what do you do? This is the great dilemma with government. What do you do when you have somebody who suddenly they have the power and they're doing the wrong thing? They're pursuing evil. And
it's not just doing the wrong thing, because you can be, there are a lot of mediocre kings who just don't, let's take Edward II, maybe himself, who maybe wasn't one of England's
doing an
greatest
evil
kings.
thing, I guess.
But this is
doing
somebody
real
who goes
evil
beyond just being incompetent. This is somebody who consciously destroys innocent people.
Right. And just to clarify, that's what I meant. Like, an incompetent government is one thing, but I don't think that's generally the problem human beings face. I think we like to tell ourselves that. We constantly say, oh, these people, what's wrong? The truth is that people in power are often evil. And I think that, power attracts evil people. I'm not saying always. I mean, obviously, I don't think that at all. I think Louis IX was a great and good king. I think Richard the Lionheart was a great and good king. But I think Philip IV was an evil man. And I think he did. The question is often asked, well, why did he do this? Well, I think and you actually say this in your book. You said, well, it's simple why he did it. It was greed and power, and that's why he did it. And he was a vile, barbaric individual, and that's why he did it.
And I would go on to say that one of the reasons I did reissue this is because, having written it, my sister was a journalist in Latin America in the 70s and 80s. And she had a lot of Argentine friends. And it was one of her close Argentine friends who was then living in Washington, read this book when it first came out, and he said to me, I mean, this was like one of those earth-shaking moments because I had not realized he had been one of the people who had been disappeared and tortured. He said to me, "Your book captures exactly the psychological problem of dealing with the aftermath of torture." And that still sends chills down my
Yeah.
spine because this was somebody I was sitting in the living room with who obviously hadn't been killed. It hadn't been bad enough for me to actually see on the outside what he had gone through, but
Mm-hmm.
he had. And
Yeah.
yeah, this is still something that goes on.
Yes, it's happening today. It's happening in in a very real way in several parts of the world today.
Yeah.
And I won't get into current political stuff
No,
on the
but
air, but
but let's just say that that's why the book is still relevant. It's set in the 13th
it's very
century,
relevant. Yeah.
but
Mhm.
the story is still horribly, horribly relevant.
It
And
reminds
we
me.
mm,
Well, I was just gonna say really quick. Years ago, I read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago about the
mm,
Soviet Union, and that book. I remember I was in college at the time, and that was earth shattering for me because it's you look at this situation these people were in. The Soviet Union was this evil empire. I mean, just the level of evil that this power structure uh,
created, yeah.
it created. Yeah, it was. I mean, you're living in hell. It's like the devil is in power and is inflicting violence and brutality on good innocent people, and it's a similar thing to what's expressed in your book. I mean, the sense of powerlessness, to be arrested by an unjust authority and then to be tortured by that unjust authority. And again, like looking at Percy, everything that he goes through, uh, on the one hand, your humanity kind of gets broken down. You're deprived of your dignity, obviously. A lot of your will to resist can be
Yeah.
broken down. But then, like you mentioned earlier, once he recovers, there's that dilemma you're faced with of how do you respond to this? Do you seek out vengeance? Because that's the thing. I've watched a couple people I know in my life be unjustly targeted by the legal system and go through some difficult things. And I'll never forget the sense of outrage and anger I had. And like, you watch, like, I think today we see this in our legal system. Like what right does this prosecutor have to stand there and say these lies? This person is vile, and
Mm.
justice demands that they be held accountable. It's like that's the thing that's so interesting. Is like you get into these situations where an innocent person is being put through this process, and meanwhile, all the people doing it to them, they're the people who actually should be subject to justice and should be made to suffer. That's the anyway. Just some thoughts there on that. I don't know if you wanted to continue on
No,
on that
I
theme.
think if we don't want to probably go on beyond an hour, so maybe we should move to some of the other issues here. I guess because you asked, I mean, Percy is the core of this, is the core of the novel. It is Percy's story. It's the story of somebody who's broken and then how they respond to that. And it's not, as you say, we don't want to spoilers, but it's not all plain sailing or perfect. It's a very difficult course, and it's also about his relationship, therefore, with his faith and the church. It's not just about injustice in a political sense,
Right.
because this is his own church. That it is the Pope
Right.
who is
Hmm.
complicit in what happens, and
Yes.
it really, I have entered the book in religious categories for awards because I think this is very much a book about faith as well as it is about, as you say, political justice and systems. So, and the other characters in the book around him all have a role to play. So even though Percy is very much the dominant character and the protagonist, as I say, he's rescued by a odd couple, if you like, because it's an old man is the hero of St. Louis' Night. So he's a young man who had, as a young man, he had been in the a Templar novice, or not really a novice because they didn't have novice knights. You had to be a knight before you could become a Knight Templar, but he had been a Templar squire, which, as you all know, were actually civil. They were not in the order. They were not members of the order. But he was serving as a squire in the hopes of, when he was trained enough, being able to enter the order. And then he's with St. Louis on crusade, and he goes through this horrible moment at Montserrat where most everybody's killed, and he has a crisis of faith which leads to him denying Christ. I'll get ahead. This is not a huge spoiler. And as a result of that, the then Templar Master Tasonic refuses to take him into the order, but St. Louis knights him because he's still been very heroic and has fought well. And then two of them, St. Louis and Tasonic, together basically save his life by taking him out of Egypt, sending him with dispatches to get back to Damietta, and they're on to Accra. So he's not there when the army is captured. And then he becomes a secular knight. He serves St. Louis as a secular knight, and he marries a young heiress, and who's a Najak, and because St. Louis rewards him with the heiress. And so in the tale of the English Templar, he is now an old man. His wife has already died. The heiress is dead. He has a son and two grandsons and two granddaughters. And the youngest granddaughter, Felice, is his pride and joy. She's only 16, but she's very intelligent, and he's taught her, Latin and Greek, and she's, going to a convent school, and she's the apple of his eye. And these are the two that save Percy, because it's Felice who finds them. As I say, that's in the very first scene. I'm not spoiling anything. And she knows that her grandfather wouldn't let him die, so she gets her grandfather to come. And the two of them then, or mostly Geoffrey, the old man, organizes his entire rescue, which is complicated. So we're not going to go into that. We'll let that be. But this old man is dedicated to the order, to the Knights Templar. He's basically, in his heart, still believes in them and believes in the cause. So he is very much the more dry. As I say, Percy's ambiguous and ambivalent about this whole thing. Geoffrey's not. Geoffrey is determined to defend the order and to get them declared innocent. He's a very, very strong personality in his own. And of course, it's easy for Geoffrey. He's a French nobleman with lots of money, and he's an old man. He turns 80 in the course of the night. He's ready to die. If he has to die for this, he will die for this, because what does he have to lose? He's lived this long, wonderful life, And then Felice, of course, is young. She's a complex character, because on one level, she's very young, she's very naive, but she's also well educated, and she's also she has that kind of innocent, should we say innocent faith, or can we say that goodness that you sometimes get, I think, almost in children, I think, J. Stephen, that kind of innocent goodness that says this is right because it's right, and I can do nothing. She's not corrupted yet. If it's right, then you have to do it. And there's no if, buts, maybe, and
right. It's doing the right thing, because it's the right thing to do, versus bargaining with yourself over how can I gain advantage. Yeah, and like you're saying, I have 3 kids. I can tell you, children don't see any of that. They really don't. They very much have a natural sense of right and wrong. And sometimes when they encounter something that to us seems like normal, but to them they say, well, that's not right. Why would somebody do that? So
it's not fair. But
right.
That's not
Stuff
fair.
Like that,
the sense of things being fair or not fair is very, very, sort of independent of what we teach them, I feel like.
And I think Felice is kind of shaped by her grandfather's ideals. To me, the character of Geoffrey really represents the pre-corrupt time for the Kingdom of France. France in the age of this good king, Louis the Ninth. That is a very real thing. You do see societies go through this thing where there's a phase where there is justice, where the people in charge are good people, and then that changes, and then you have the corrupt individuals come to power, you have the evil individuals come to power, and there can be that I mean, I imagine people in the Soviet Union may have like felt this way about, prior to the revolution, you had an age of higher ideals. We don't have to get into that,
No,
but
no, but there's this wonderful joke about this old man stumbling around, and he's picked up by the police, and they trying to get his identity of who he is and where he is, and the bottom line is, he said, where do you live in Leningrad? Where did you go to school? St. Petersburg. Where you were trying, where do you live now? Leningrad. Where were you born? In St. Petersburg, in Petrograd.
right.
And then they say, where are you trying to go? You're wandering around. And he said, I'm trying to get back to St. Petersburg.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And that's this character of Geoffrey. He represent, Louis the Ninth kind of like casts a shadow on this book, because this was a good king, and Geoffrey was he was a knight who stood beside that good king.
Yeah.
And now in this age of corruption, he wants to fight. And I think that's a real thing. Like, as you get older, you start to realize that maybe there is a certain courage that comes with age, I think, because like you're saying, like, well, I'm at the end of my life. I'm going to stand up for my ideals. It might be easier to speak out on behalf of your ideals as you get older. So just to kind of let everybody know that a big part of this novel is that it is about the idea of the Templars and some of their friends resisting in some way. And what inspired Helena to explore this is there was a council at Vienne, a church council in Vienne, where a group of Templars actually showed up. And you can talk more about this, Helena, if you want, but in full regalia, and said they represented a group of several thousand free Templars, and wanted to argue on behalf of the order. It's kind of a footnote in the trial of the Templars, but it really is intriguing. And I think, I don't know if you want to talk more about that, Helena, but that is kind of what you were exploring here.
So as I say, this isn't just, it is, I didn't come up with this idea of some resistance out of nowhere. It is in all of the major history books. It says that at the Council of Vienne, which was supposed to just be a cut and dried rubber stamp on the decision that had already been made, but they made this appeal that with the foreign, and particularly apparently the Archbishop of Canterbury and some of the foreign bishops and cardinals, and says, no, we can't trust confessions that were by torture. I mean, everybody at the time knew that the torture had been involved. So the French tried to send torturers to England because the English were so backward and didn't have any of their own. And everybody knew that. And so there was serious resistance inside the church from bishops and cardinals to the decision against the Templars. Cyprus, as I said, the Holy Roman Empire, certainly the Iberian states, which wanted the Templars intact because they were still fighting the occupation. So within the church, there was opposition to the idea of getting rid of the order. And so some of these voices actually said the Templars should have a right to defend themselves. And the French, so confident that they'd eliminated all of the opposition because they, burned them as relapsed heretics, for those who had tried to defend. The 600 who initially said they defend the order, many of them had confessed, so they were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics, and that basically killed the courage of the others to stand up. So they were fairly confident that no one would show up. And instead of that, as I say, 7, 9, 12, it's different versions. Templars arrive in full montage and say they're there at the request of the Council of Vienne to defend the order. And they claim to be representing between 1,500 and 2,000 still free Templars in the woods around Lyon. And that's the core of how could they, who were they and where did they come from and who might they have been, how might that have been? And so the novel is between the 2 points of the story of the broken knight to the story of building up a resistance organization that appears at the Council of Vienne, or is represented at the Council of Vienne. the real core of the novel is the story of Percy himself as an individual. But obviously, this idea that as he becomes stronger, he becomes more active in trying to fight the injustice is the plot line.
Right.
And I wanted, while we were talking about the characters, I want to come back to the other character that I personally think is strong, and that is the character of Umberto. And this is a young cleric who, in the beginning, actually he's not a bad person. But the key thing about Umberto is that he is actually he's a nice young man whose family has decided he's supposed to go into, holy orders because whatever, he's the second or third son or whatever. And he's fine, he's at the university. And then he gets pulled into this, but in the sense not of the victim, but of being tempted with power, and so that the other characters use his innate ambition, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think people should be ambitious. I don't like people who have absolutely no desire to do anything and are content to, just let other people do everything. I think ambition is a powerful force that can be harnessed for good as well as evil. But here is a young man who gets harnessed to the evil cause of the destruction of the Templars and is basically recruited for the Inquisition. And it's also his story. So as when you have Percy's story, you also, on the other side, you have Umberto's story of how his soul is corrupted by being part of the evil.
Yeah, basically what happens with him is it's the temptation to compromise with power, even though you see it doing evil. And that's actually an interesting thing in the book, is that most of the characters who are participating in what the Inquisition is doing and what the king is doing, they understand that it's based on lies. And I think that is actually the case in a lot of situations where you have a government that's doing something wrong. People know it. People know that the government's lying, that the leaders are lying, but they go along with it because, well, I'm trying to advance my position. I'll make a little money. And there's almost even a thought, maybe, well, I'll go along with this, but then, maybe later I can do something once I've gained some position, or I might be doing a little bit of evil now, but your character of Umberto, he's very distressed the first time he is involved in a torture like that. That's a really, and that is one thing about this book, guys, that is so powerful, is sort of the reality of what it would be to actually torture someone. And that is very vividly presented in this book. And I think that's important, again, not because it's pleasant, but because it's true that this happens.
Yeah, that's that's one of the reasons I feel like I think the book will never be hugely successful, because most people really don't like reading about these kinds of I mean, just as commercially, because it was probably not a wise thing to do it. But
well, I mean, I think the Templars are very interesting, and the Templars are a popular topic on my channel, and so I'm hoping that those of you who have followed what I've been doing about the Templars will pick up this book, because I think it's a good way to continue exploring that question. But yeah, and we've got a couple more talking points we want to get to. I'm going to go ahead and look through a couple of the questions here, see if there's anything we want to address right now. And if you guys have any questions, you can ask them and we will try to address them. We really want to stick to topics that are relevant to this. So, the trial of the Templars. I saw. So Mrs. Gale asks, who was the Pope during this time? And that's Clement V. And that might be kind of interesting. I'll go and ask you this, Helena. What was the dynamic between the king and the Pope at this time? And why was the Pope so compliant?
The most people believe that. I mean, I am not an expert on papal politics. There may be people in the audience who are much better versed in this. As far as I know, he basically owed his election to Philip IV. Clement V, first of all, owed his election to Philip. Secondly, Philip the Fourth had taken out his predecessor, was his an immediate successor, but with practically the same charges as against the Templars, accusing him also of heresy and I don't know, whatever, sodomy and everything, and had him arrested and removed. So that there's a sense of Philip had no compunction about attacking a pope and killing him if necessary. I mean, he did not hang him. He did not actually publicly kill the Pope, but he drove him to his death. And there are those who believe he was poisoned by Philip IV. But he was certainly he was accused, as I say, of practically the same crimes as the Templars, and removed from power. And so there was a precedent of a pope being destroyed by Philip IV, and then Clement V himself probably owed his position to it. That said, I don't find that a very good excuse, because once you're Pope, you are Pope, and you do have power. And again, the Templars could have been his army. If he'd wanted to stand up to Philip IV, he could have actually asked those knights to come back to, Avignon and be his defense. I'm probably being naive about that, frankly, but I find it very, very hard to have sympathy for Clement V. I haven't personally been able to find any reason why I should accept or justify, what he did.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because this is, 100 years after, or roughly 100 years after the reign of Pope Innocent III, who really was the dominant figure in European politics at that time. But things were changing a lot, and the King of France was arguably the most powerful figure in Europe at this time. And yeah, I mean, I really agree with you that, and again, that's another interesting thing. The question of, it would have been difficult for the Pope to have exercised his power in this circumstance, but it also would have been the right thing to do, to defy, defy the king in this situation.
There were times when he was basically he was essentially imprisoned in France. When he was in Poitiers, he's surrounded by French troops. He could not, at that time, operate independently. I do agree that he was constrained by the power. At the same time, he could have gone to Cyprus. He could have gone to the Holy Roman Empire. He could have gone to Portugal. That would have meant leaving a power base. That would have meant leaving probably a lot of his fortune behind. I mean, but he wasn't willing, and there were things he could have done to take himself out of the control of Philip IV, but they were things he was not willing to do.
And there were popes who did things like that. Gregory VII is a good example, who left Rome. And the interesting thing about taking a stand like that, when you're in the right and you have the authority, but yet there's a power that is able to, in practical terms, oppose that and create problems for you. Often when you still do the heroic thing and you do the hard thing, often history vindicates you, for that. And in this case, certainly that would be the case. And let's see here. So this is maybe kind of a practical question. What is your preferred place to purchase this book? I'll let you answer that, Helen.
It doesn't make any difference to me. I'm on both Barnes and Nobles and on Amazon, and my royalties are the same regardless of what platform you use. So please use whatever platform you prefer.
Yeah, and guys, do please leave reviews for this book.
Oh, please. Oh my God, that has become so important. It's ridiculous, but where you come up, whether they show the book, whether you're allowed to be on BookBub, whether you're allowed, everything nowadays is based on the number of reviews. I think it's crazy. I think it's wrong. I think it's unjust. I think it's because I get offers every day to buy. I can buy reviews. For $8,000, I can get 1,000 reviews. I don't have that kind of money, and I also don't approve of that. I don't think it's right. And yet you'll see books on Amazon with thousands, tens of thousands of reviews, although from the statistics from the book industry, they haven't sold 10,000 copies. and nobody reads 10,000 reviews, and most of the reviews will just say something like, this is awesome, I loved everything by this book, I'll read anything by this author, without saying what it is or what it's about or who it is, because they've been bought by, they're sitting somewhere in, I don't know, India, and writing reviews by the thousand and making a living off of it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, please, I need real reviews.
Yeah.
If you read it, please leave a review. Or a rating. That's a
Yeah.
horrible thing. I shouldn't even say they're not even reviews. They're rating. Amazon allows you, if you download a book for free, you can still leave a rating. So people who don't even read books just get paid to click 5 stars on the books they download for nothing, and that distorts the whole market.
And here's one from Powell. Hi, my question is, since when has the Vatican made the documents from the Templar trial available? And have you observed any changes in how scholars have perceived the order since then?
The answer is, I have not seen any change among scholars. I don't know if people who aren't scholars have been influenced by it. But yes, the Vatican did publish, what was it, in 2014, clear statement that they were completely innocent. And yet you'll still read non-scholars talking about them as if they were heretics. That's the whole mythology of the Templars and all the conspiracy theories. They just live on and on and on, regardless. I would say scholars felt vindicated because they knew they'd come down on the side of the Templars being innocent long before the Vatican opened their archives. But having that fact, the fact that the archives were open and the Pope itself said, or the Vatican itself said, there is no evidence of heresy or wrongdoing on the Templars, is huge. There's,
yes,
that is really, really important.
And I believe you mentioned in the historical notes for the book, you said Pope Benedict XVI actually officially ruled that the Templars were innocent. So the Pope has officially cleared them of any wrongdoing. And, I mean, again, the charges that Philip leveled against them, this is a point that Barber and Nicholson both make, is that these were boilerplate medieval slanders. I mean, like, they worship Satan, they worship the head of a cat, they were they were sodomites. I mean, this and one of the points that Barber actually mentions in his book is how, one thing we forget too about medieval society is how, rooms were smaller and everything was closer together. And like, the idea that the Templars would be carrying out these elaborate satanic rituals in Paris, right next to where the king had his apartments, it's just ridiculous. I mean,
or the idea that they had all these secret things in their order. The rule was published. Right. Anybody could read the Templar rule. It's written down. It was not a secret document,
Yeah.
But okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've
You're preaching to converted.
That's true, but it's just but like you mentioned, there are people out there who will still say things like, oh, well, they got corrupt over time. Well, the only way you can think that is if you just don't know anything about their history. Because, I mean, were there individual Templars who maybe did something underhanded? I'm sure that happened, but in terms of like the function of the order throughout its history, there wasn't some kind of gradual process in which that changed or in which it became, less focused on its mission. I mean, they were entirely focused on their mission through their whole history.
The problem is the loss of the Holy Land, because the Templars are not founded until, of course, the Christians have control of Jerusalem. And with the loss of Jerusalem, well, not just Jerusalem, with the loss of Acre, they are in a kind of quasi no man's land, because there's no clear, the mission of protecting pilgrims to the Holy Land is more or less OBE, because it really is too dangerous at that time to go to the Holy Land.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this was sort of a period between 1291 and the destruction of the Templar in 1308. These 2 decades were a period when the Templars had lost a lot of their reason for being. Now, they were trying to reorganize a new crusade, etc. And obviously the Iberian Peninsula and, of course, the Teutonic Knights still had their mission. I don't think it's fair, as you say, to say that they'd lost their they had become corrupt or lost. But we can't ignore the fact that they had lost their justification for existence.
Right. But Helen Nicholson, I mean, one of the points she makes is that in the popular imagination, that their how they were viewed popularly hadn't really changed. I mean, they were still kind of this idealized order of holy knights, and that's why it was such a shock too. But yeah, like you said, I do think that there was kind of a crisis in well, what do we do next, type thing, certainly.
But they were still considered so incorruptible that people trusted them to manage.
Right.
That's why they were the bankers, was because the
Right.
Templars, you couldn't trust. There were a lot of people you couldn't trust, certainly not the Italian bankers, maybe with your money. But this
Right.
idea that the Knights Templar were so incorruptible that kings and barons used them as their treasury,
Hmm.
and that has not changed. This
Yeah.
idea that they are considered, as you say, in some way corrupt, or that certainly hadn't changed. But I think they're the idea that they had been created for the defense or the protecting pilgrims to the Holy Land, and the Holy Land is lost, had a severe impact on their standing.
Yeah. And again, just kind of another common misunderstanding. One thing I will run into on YouTube is people will leave comments. They'll say, well, the Templars were engaged in banking scams. They were charging interest. And that's actually not true. They did not
No,
engage in usury. They didn't charge interest. They didn't. And if, like you said, Helena, the reason they were managing finances for, important people was because they weren't engaging in banking scams. Their wealth was obtained through donations. It was wealthy patrons, and even some and small donations too. People granting them estates, granting them wealth because of their belief in the mission of the Templars.
yep.
So here's a. Did you have something else on that?
No, I'm really glad. I'd like to say, I was just going to say, let's just see more questions.
Yeah, we have a few more questions. So Ryan K. in 1307, did the Pope want church control of what Philip started? Did he initially condemn Philip's actions and ask him to return the Templars and all their property to the church?
You may have been doing more recent research. As I said, I did my basic research for this 30 years ago. My understanding is that Clement initially didn't, then he did, and then he didn't. It was just, he kept changing his position. If you've
Yeah,
been doing more.
I would say that basically is about how it went. I do think we can say there were times when Clement did sort of try to maneuver to regain control of the process. He called a couple church councils to kind of try to review it. There were occasions when royal troops would simply show up and take control of that situation and threaten people's lives. I mean, yeah, but Clement ultimately, yeah, he was afraid, and he wasn't willing to risk his own life to to oppose this. So that is true. And we have Grimster here saying they're buying a copy today. So thank you, Grimster.
Thank you.
All right, and let's see if there's a couple more questions. Let's see. Welsh Muslim Dave says, how difficult was the research process for the book?
Oh, it's really not, because there's just so much has been written. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, the fun part was being, of course, in the south of France and visiting so many of these places and seeing them and visit. The atmospherics of going to some of these commanderies is marvelous. I recommend it. I wish this book was in English, because it was like, no matter where you go in France, you just can go to whatever Provence, area you're in, and find where the Templars were and find some of their places and being there. And then the guidebooks will talk about their role there and what it was like, and they'll all have a take on it. And then, as I say, if you know the major scholars, you look at them, you look at their sources, you look at what they recommend. And there's such good scholarship on the Knights Templar. It's not an obscure topic at all.
Right.
The trial of the Templar is so well documented. I mean, it was all written down. There were lawyers, there were trials. It was the confessions were all taken down. There were transcripts, etc. So I don't think, obviously, it would help if I had medieval Latin and medieval French, which I don't. But frankly, I didn't find that a disadvantage just because there's just so much good, really solid research on this topic.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, from RB Gaming, how did the suppression of the Knights Templar by the French crown influence their present legacy in England, and what lasting effects, if any, can still be seen in English law, architecture, etc.? Okay.
As I say, it made me change my mind a little about Edward II, because I really thought, wow, he really did stand up at first, and then he decided to get greedy too. But I don't know that there was major influence on England. I do think, though, that it does say something about the difference of the two countries, that the British initially said they didn't approve of torture. And of course, there's still that thing. I find it totally plausible that if you have, not all the English Templars were arrested, that they would, some of them would disappear up into Scotland because Robert the Bruce was excommunicate. So, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the French king and the Pope couldn't reach into Scotland. So what better place to be if you're an English Templar than in Scotland? And if you're a trained knight, you're going to probably give your sword to the person who's giving you refuge. So the idea that there was Templars or former Templars fought with Robert the Bruce seems perfectly logical to me, without being anything, I don't know, strange and mythical and whatever. Architecturally, I don't think there's that much. I mean, Templar architecture, I think Helen Nicholson has done a lot about, there is no such real thing as Templar architecture. Not all the Templar churches are round or based on the Holy Sepulchre or things like that. There's all sorts of different variations, and you'll find them in the UK as well as other places. So I don't know that there is that much, lasting effect from this.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's a good set of questions for us. So just to wrap up, everyone. So yeah, the book is called The Tale of the English Templar. We're here with Helena Schrader, and it's a really, go ahead.
Be sure you don't just buy the English Templar, because that's the old version, the 30-year-old version, which it's longer, it's not as well written. It's not as concise. It's not as focused. It was what I was writing 30 years ago. It's also more expensive, and it's only in paperback. But just so that you don't confuse, because that's still out there. You can't kill a book nowadays, certainly not on Amazon. So be sure you order The Tale of the English Templar with this cover on it, please.
Yes, and I have it linked in the description, guys, so you can check it out. A really interesting historical fiction treatment of the trial of the Templars, and delves into the idea of groups of Templars kind of banding together and resisting to some extent, which there is some, bits of evidence for that in the history of the trial of the Templars. So that's a big part of what's explored here. So, which for me, I mean, that's kind of, when you're actually studying the trial of the Templars, you're just thinking to yourself, I wish they would fight back and go do some damage to Philip and his people. But and to some extent, we see a little bit of that in this book. So really great historical fiction. I really enjoyed it. So I think you guys will too. So do pick up a copy. And, we're really glad to have Helena with us today to talk about this. So thanks for joining me today, Helena.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And thanks everybody for being there.
Absolutely. So yeah, we'll have to do this again soon.
When your book comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it would be interesting to even maybe pick a couple of topics within this book and maybe explore them a little more deeply. So we'll talk about that, Helena.
Okay, great.
We'll get to that. So, okay, everybody. Well, that kind of puts us at an hour. So we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. And thanks to everybody for being here. And yeah, pick up a copy of The Tale of the English Templar. Make sure you get the brand new version that Helena has released, and it's linked in the description below.